Critics love it, audiences love it, heck, everybody loves it. But there are still a few John Wick moments that have fans baying for blood. Warning, spoilers ahead for John Wick Chapter 4. John Wick Chapter 4 ups the stakes early on by killing off a fan-favorite recurring character, Sharon, the cool, collected concierge of the New York Continental.
How good to see you again so soon, Mr. Wick.
What makes this moment even more shocking is the fact that Sharon is coldly executed in retaliation for a problem that is entirely outside of his control. He essentially dies to make sure we understand our new villain, the Marquis von Zondergramont, is a really bad dude. After years of faithful service in the name of the High Table, Sharon goes out as collateral damage. And it's all because Winston doesn't hit John Wick with a fatal shot at the end of the last movie. It's harsh, to say the least. This death hits especially hard, as John Wick Chapter 4 landed in theaters right on the heels of Lance Reddick's sudden death at the age of 60. This adds an unfortunate too soon cloud over the story beat. As with many of Reddick's best roles, the actor brings a calm and clear-eyed gravitas to Sharon that cements the Continental as an authoritative edifice of power and meaning. He also plays fantastically off the expressive, wry tones of Ian McShane's performance. It's a tremendous shame that John Wick Chapter 4 will be his last appearance as the character. Reddick had been set to reprise a role in the franchise's ballerina spin-off movie. The first two sequels to John Wick basically begin in media res. If you're not familiar, this is story speak for mid-fight scene. These action-packed features pick up the moment the prior movie leaves off. John Wick Chapter 4, by contrast, starts remarkably slow, and it takes the movie a ponderous half-hour to set the table for the first big fight scene at the Osaka Continental. Relative to the quick pace that's made the franchise successful so far, this is a bold gamble for the fourth movie to take.
Just have fun, Albert.
It's bolder still because it requires the audience to have a better than cursory recall of the John Wick timeline thus far. As some fans have pointed out, it's actually kind of hard to recall the details of the Wick versus archaic plot mechanics, even for devoted fans. The first three movies primarily focus on a multi-sensory barrage of fight scenes that just don't leave much RAM in your mind to grasp all the markers, tattoos, clans, and odd bits of Latin. And despite how long it takes to get going, John Wick Chapter 4 doesn't work too hard to explain what's going on. Some viewers might have to Google who the dude in the desert John kills in the beginning even is to understand what's at stake. The villains of the John Wick franchise take many shapes and forms. Chapter 4 takes a path untrodden with the Marquis, its main antagonist, who is mostly frightening because of what he represents. Just like John Wick himself, the High Table, of which the Marquis is a senior member, is more of an idea that can't be killed than an actual group of mortal people. The Marquis cements this by acting as a sadistic personification of ancient forces like greed and power. John Wick Chapter 4 finds a particularly brutal way to let us know the Marquis is more twisted than usual. The vicious villain subjects Mr. Nobody to a horrific test of will. Stabbing the bounty hunter through the hand, the Marquis essentially demands that he pulls his hand out through the knife's blade instead of pulling the blade upwards. Mr. Nobody, apparently willing to do anything for a shot at the John Wick contract, complies in a squeamish bit of realistic effects work. Though it's a moment that fits perfectly with the over-the-top John Wick style, it's more visceral and intense than the franchise's normal fists and guns melees, prompting at least a few groans of disgust in theaters. In general, the John Wick movies rely more on the poetry of their action sequences than the dramatic tension of the narrative. This approach shows the most strain in John Wick Chapter 4, which slows down between action set pieces to give us time to think. What this means, of course, is that the audience members are a lot more likely to think, wait, what's actually going on here? For example, Kane and Mr. Nobody follow John Wick around the entire movie. They're sort of trying to kill him, but they always manage to let him go. At no point is this more confusing than when they interrupt his face-off with Killer Harkin, a ruthless crime lord who killed his former mentor.
You want to kill him? I want to kill him. What about you, Mr. Wick?
It's unclear why either mercenary is waiting so long to kill John Wick, or why John himself is acting so coy about attacking Killer. In truth, the whole scene really just seems like a thin excuse for him to end up with the famous dead man's hand of aces and AIDS during a poker game. It also contains one of the most confusing Kane-related moments. Despite being blind, he can tell exactly what his hand is. Star Wars fans might at least enjoy this unintentional callback to Rogue One, in which actor Donnie Yen also plays a blind character who can still sort of see, but everyone else will be more than a little lost. Perhaps in tacit acknowledgement that the audience might be getting somewhat desensitized to human-on-human violence after 4 movies, John Wick Chapter 4 throws in a very different sort of heart-skipping moment late in its runtime. This scene goes back to the first movie's potent well by placing a dog in jeopardy, although this time it's a thankfully brief moment of canine peril. Mr. Nobody's faithful companion has more than won us over by the time he gets rudely tossed into a windshield by the Marquis's top henchman, Chidi. Despite the fact that he all but shatters the glass and bounces into the street, the dog gets right back up and barks to let us know he's okay. Some fans, perhaps still scarred from the first movie, have even taken to platforms like Reddit to make sure the dog lives before they actually see the movie. Money makes the world go round, and that's especially true in the John Wick universe. How do we know this? By the fact that, as the bounty on John Wick grows, hundreds upon hundreds of people decide that the price is suddenly right to take him on themselves, even though the many previous attempts on the life of Baba Yaga have failed. Yet there are still exceptions to this rule. For most of John Wick Chapter 4, it seems like Mr. Nobody is a rare character to realize this. He seems content to simply track John from place to place and try to bilk the Marquis for a finder's fee. But late in the game, we learn that even Mr. Nobody has a price: $40 million. After this, he goes all out in an effort to bag John. This happens after he gets a drop on the unkillable protagonist multiple times. Sadly, Mr. Nobody loses a fair amount of intrigue when we realize that he's just like people who only play the lottery when it gets over $1 billion. When he changes his mind again after John saves his dog's life, it endears him to us, but it doesn't make his character any more coherent.
You ready, John? Yeah.
Even before the release of John Wick Chapter 4, fans pointed out that its 169-minute runtime is seriously lengthy. This is a serious departure for the franchise. The first 3 movies in the series endeared themselves to fans, in part by being sprints instead of marathons. Even the biggest John Wick fan might feel like the 4th installment needs to be shorter. All kinds of recent movies seem to be pushing 3 hours these days, and the John Wick formula doesn't lend itself too well to a bloated runtime. The movie's length really puts a strain on the scenes between action sequences, which mostly consist of characters explaining made-up high-table rules that are kinda hard to follow. Besides, who wants to miss a killer action scene because their bladder just can't take it? Give us an intermission next time! Yes, you'd better believe it, John Wick dies at the end. The same John Wick we've watched kill thousands of people in a few days over the course of the first 3 movies. The same John Wick who easily survived getting hit by 4 cars and falling down 500 concrete steps. The incomparable, merciless Baba Yaga, whose name is in the title of every movie. Our protagonist's death in what might be the final chapter of the main franchise has fans shocked and divided. Some feel like it undermines the whole story, while others are hoping it's a total fake-out. After so much violence and death, it really does feel like John Wick's defining character trait is his ability to survive in spite of impossible odds. It's mildly satisfying that his actions help Kane become free of the high table and allow Winston to get the Continental restored. But for John, the outcome is no different than if it died at any of the hundreds of earlier points in the saga when someone has tried to kill him. With no one left to avenge, there's a strange and potent kind of beauty in John Wick surviving for his own sake. His apparent death, in contrast, seems to support the Marquis's more nihilistic view. He sees John as essentially defined by death, and according to this movie, that may be true, and it could be the final word on the matter. John Wick Chapter 4 attempts to come full circle as John sits dying on the steps of the Sacré-Cœur. His life flashes before his eyes, and we see him with his wife as he lingers on their brief and lovely marriage. But as some fans have been quick to point out, Daisy, the adorable beagle his wife left him after her death, the dog whose murder draws him back into the assassin world in the first place, is nowhere to be seen.
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm back.
Now, we mean no offense to the memory of Helen Wick. John loved her immensely, but Daisy deserves to be in the montage as well. John cared so much for her that he kicked off an entire cinematic saga in response to her untimely demise. Seeing her fail to appear in the montage is kind of like watching the Oscars snub people by leaving them out of the In Memoriam segment. John Wick Chapter 4 is the first film in the John Wick franchise to feature an after-credits scene, much to the consternation of many fans who, not expecting one, left the theater early. It's disappointing from a certain angle to see a movie franchise once confident enough in its own appeal to eschew such ending teasers of future events suddenly bow to the trend. It's also kind of a big ask to make an audience that just sat through the longest John Wick movie yet. Moreover, the fans who do make it all the way might be disappointed, as the scene itself is maddeningly brief. Akira, unsurprisingly, has tracked Kane down to avenge her father's death. In a public square, she approaches a seemingly oblivious Kane and whips out a knife, but the screen cuts to black, leaving both of their fates unknown. This is frustrating enough on its own, but John Wick Chapter 4 also disappoints grief-stricken fans who might have hoped that a post-credit scene would hint that John Wick isn't really dead after all.